Just want to make a quick video on flashing the EEPROM on 97 and up Jeep Cherokees and 97 and up TJs. I think until 2001 is the year for the TJs. Not super familiar with the TJ gauge clusters, but the Cherokee ones I've spent quite a lot of time messing around with them. So there's a great video on YouTube by a guy named CO Robot Chicken, who explains how to use a EEPROM programmer to essentially read the EEPROM on the back of the speedometer and get the data off of it. I've already done that, so I'm going to load that file. He does a really great job of explaining how to do all the connection stuff, but I wanted to touch on some of the stuff he left out on the video, specifically how to go from two different types of clusters. In his video, he was going from basically one cluster to an identical one. If you're going from, say, one with the dummy lights, or you're going from a full cluster to the police package cluster, which is what I'm trying to do, there's some other stuff to keep in mind. Essentially, all of the bits from here to here are basically the configuration for the cluster. They tell it what type of cluster it is, what the top mileage is, basically configuration for it all. And so when you go from one type of cluster to a different type of cluster, this info is going to be different. And if you put the wrong info in the cluster, it can actually confuse it. I've already done this, but what I was attempting to do when I discovered all this was go from 100-mile-an-hour cluster to the police package cluster. And so I just copied everything from the very top to the very bottom over to the police cluster, and suddenly everything's off because it thinks it's a 100-mile-an-hour cluster, even though the numbers on it go to 125. So what I want to show you here is how the mileage works. Essentially, the mileage in the odometer is this data here, and it's done in a pretty smart way that isn't the most intuitive, but essentially they've striped it across 50 bits across the EEPROM so that they're not rewriting to a single point repeatedly, causing it to wear out. And the way it works is essentially each one of these cells is a 2-mile increment, essentially, and there's 50 of them, so that equates to 100 miles total that's counted across this. And these 4 digits you see are the 4 most significant digits on the odometer. So in my case, it's 120,700 miles. And you can see that this 120,700 only goes to here, and then it switches over to 120,600. And so essentially, the way the math works is each one of these cells equates to 2 miles. This is 120,700. This next cell is 120,702 miles, and so forth up to here. So on my particular odometer, it's 120,728 miles. And by the time you get down to the bottom, and all 50 cells are with the same digit, then what you have is basically 120,798. I think in CO Robot Chicken's video, he actually had a gauge cluster that ended on 98. So he made a comment that you only have 100 digits of precision. You don't. You actually have down to essentially 1 digit, kind of. He happened to have 98, so all of the digits were identical to him. And it showed basically a bunch of identical numbers, and he incorrectly said that they were losing up to 100 miles of range. Anyway, the next bit of important info that's stored on here is the VIN, and it's actually stored on here 3 times. It's striped across. I'm not entirely sure why it's on here 3 times, but it is for redundancy. And the way these cells works is each one of these cells stores 2 bits of data, essentially. And you can't divide 17 VIN digits by 2. So what they've essentially done is they've made 18 digits equal to the VIN, and they've just tacked on an extra 1 to the end of the VIN. So the VIN, being 17 numbers long, goes to 66241. There's an extra one that's not part of the VIN, and then the VIN starts again because the VIN is in here 2 times. So this is the second VIN, and then the third VIN is here, if you look here. So 3 times VIN, and then everything from here down is configuration data, as well as there's a couple of digits in between the end of the mileage and the start of the VIN that are also configuration data. And so when you go from 100 mile an hour to 125 mile an hour, you need to retain these from the 125 mile an hour VIN. So if I open up file load and I load in the 125 mile an hour cluster, you can see there is now a different mileage here, essentially. There's a couple different 6 bits of configuration data here. Here's the VIN 3 times over, and then here is the speedometer configuration data that you need to retain. So what I have essentially done is created my own configuration file that is a combination of these two to get all the details I wanted. So I saved both of these files as just a bin file. Save it somewhere on your desktop, somewhere easy you can access. And then you're going to go into a program that's called Notepad++ and open up both of those 2 files. And now you're going to need a plugin in addition to Notepad++, because Notepad++ by itself just comes up with this random string of characters that makes no sense because it's trying to read it wrong. But if you get this plugin that allows you to view it in hexadecimal, then suddenly it starts to look familiar again. Now, there are some differences between this and what you just saw in the EEPROM flasher. You'll notice here, if I load the file again, this is reading it in 16-bit mode. So essentially it combines 2 bits together, well, 16 bits together to make a 4-digit cell. If you put it in 8-bit, then you have 2 cells of 8 bits essentially. And they're going to be reversed slightly. If you look here, the cell is supposed to be 1207. If you put it in 8-bit mode, it's 0712. So it is swapping them left to right. That can cause some confusion. And so that is how Notepad++ is reading them. So this cell should be 1207. It's just swapped 1 and 0, 3 and 2, 5 and 4, and so forth and so forth. But essentially, that doesn't super matter to what we're trying to do. So, in order to get the 2 dumps we have combined into one, I'm going to create a new file, essentially. I'm going to convert it to hexadecimal with our hex editor, and we're going to copy and paste the parts we need from these 2 files into it. So I'm going to take the mileage from my original one, which goes down to here. So I'm going to copy that across and paste that right there. So there's our mileage. Then I'm going to go to my 125 mile an hour cluster. I'm going to grab this bit of configuration data here, right before the VIN. You can look at the viewer here, and it shows where the VIN starts. I'm going to copy this across into the new file. Then I'm going to go back to my 100 mile an hour cluster, and I'm going to copy the VIN data, which goes to here. And let me deselect this so you can see what I'm actually selecting. I'm just selecting the bits of the VIN. It's very convenient. If you can't see what you're looking for in this mess of numbers, look here where the VIN is, select that, and we'll show you what bit you're looking for. So we're going from 4A for the VIN start down to here, and copying this across into our new file. Then we have the VIN. Then we're going to go to the 125 mile an hour cluster again and grab the rest of the configuration data, which starts right below the VIN here. So you can see where the VIN is. It starts right below that. Essentially, we're grabbing everything down to the bottom in this one. Copy. Go over here. Drop down one more row. And paste this in below. There we go. Okay, so now we have one file that is everything we want from the two different gauge clusters kind of combined into one that we're going to then upload onto the gauge cluster. So we have, just to clarify one more time, the original mileage from the gauge cluster from our original, the Jeep we're coming from, gauge cluster. We have the configuration data from the donor cluster from, in this case, the police package Cherokee. We have the VIN info from our original gauge cluster 3 times, it's striped over. And then from the donor cluster again, we have the configuration data in there in the bottom. So essentially 4 bits of data taken from the 2 original files. And we're going to save this, file save, save it here, and then we're going to go back to our EEPROM programmer and import that. So we're going to load, browse, open this, and there we have our file. And it loads in, it defaults to 8-bit. This is the way it is in Notepad++, but if you want to verify your data, you can transfer it back to 16-bit, and you should now see it's in the correct format, and you have the correct data. You have the correct VIN here. You can read it now actually straight the correct way instead of the reverse way it was over in Notepad++, and the configuration data from the donor cluster, and then you can upload that to your IC. Anyway, that's all I wanted to show you guys, just a quick little view of some of the stuff that's going on in this file and how you can combine 2 different gauge clusters data to get the correct one for your vehicle.